Good day and welcome to Meet the Chair. Today we have Peter Baffoe, who is a resident and the Vice Chair of Peabody. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's really good to be here with you today.
Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. I'm really looking forward to working with you this year, and I'm really looking forward to you chairing the conference. So as you know, this will be our third year of going out on this conference. The conference is on the 24th of February 2026. And when you think about this space, within the space of customer experience and resident engagement conference, a lot has happened. So many things have evolved. So I'm really, really interested in talking about the conference, your views on resident engagement, what you're looking forward to. So those kind of things. So it'd be really good to hear your perspective on these different areas. So one of the things I wanted to explore with you is the Better Social Housing Review. You know that it was the first, the first collaboration between the National Housing Federation and the CIH, where they came together. They did this work. It was published, there were recommendations, and there was an action plan. It's been 3 years since all that happened. And what I would really like to understand from you is, have you seen any changes in the way that housing associations engage with their residents?
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. I think that's a great question. I think firstly, the closer working between the NHF and the CIH is a really strong thing and great for the sector. I think as a resident, I've seen a lot of improvement in terms of how residents are engaged, how residents' voice is heard, and then how it's put into action over the last several years. I think the conference in itself is an example of how customer experience and resident engagement is growing. And I think a lot of it comes from, not just housing associations being more open to it, but also from the relentless and tireless work of a lot of residents, representing residents really well in these professional spaces, being able to articulate themselves, being able to organise and campaign and uplift the resident voice and the customer experience. And I think because of those successful actions by residents across the country, it's really made it easier, I think, for housing associations to understand that we will get better outcomes for residents if they're engaged in the process and if we consider how their customer experience and customer journey goes. I've seen more and more residents on boards. I've seen more resident scrutiny groups, and all of these being, I would say, listened to and heard a lot more. And so I think over the last 3 years, that's some of the improvements that I've seen.
Well, thank you. I love some of the words that you've used there, apart from the fact that you've talked about, residents getting more involved and having that role within a housing association. You use the words outcomes, because at the end of the day, the residents are the ones that are on the receiving end of this service. So it's quite interesting to hear that all the work that's happened is also leading to positive outcomes for residents. So in terms of outcomes, I'm going to move to the next area that I thought that we could explore in this chat. The consumer regulation landscape has evolved. Housing associations, as you mentioned in the previous question that we were talking about, housing associations are now ensuring that resident voice is held at the highest level. So, Peter, you're a resident, you're also a board member, and you're the vice chair of a G15 housing association. Can you share your experience from these different areas?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Even. I think when I pause to reflect on the journey I've had of resident engagement and joining the board, becoming the chair of a committee, and then becoming the vice chair, I think it says a lot about how the housing association I'm a member of really wants to hear resident voice at every level. And I think I was struck by my first board meeting, never having sat on the board like Peabody before and seen a stack of papers and not knowing or really understanding the full extent, the wide range of work that was involved in a housing association of that size, thinking that perhaps what I could contribute to this conversation wouldn't be that helpful. However, what was really welcoming was that I was surrounded by board members and an executive team who really wanted to hear the resident voice. And my predecessors, board members who had sat on the resident board members who had sat on the board before me, were there to support me in the first instance, but had also laid down the good foundations and groundworks that helped other board members to understand that the resident voice matters. When you speak as a resident in these spaces, you're not just speaking from memory or from what you've seen, you're speaking from your actual lived experience. And that adds weight to any conversation. I also think as a resident board member, you're able to translate some perhaps abstract parts of the business and what that means in the day-to-day lives of people who live on it. And I believe that housing associations, it's not just enough to have a resident on the board. Because I always maintain I'm not the resident voice, I'm a resident voice. And my experience could be different from my neighbours, could be different from someone who's in a different part of the country, a different part of the city. And what all housing associations have to do is make sure that resident voice is in every aspect of the business. So scrutiny committees are really important. Tenant and resident associations are really important. Feedback to your neighbourhood manager is really important. But what needs to be really the golden thread is that when those interactions happen with residents, that they're fed back into the business and that changes or improvements are made. I think anything less than that becomes tokenism. And I'd like to feel, and I believe at Peabody, where I am, there are residents across the business, across the organisation, who are engaging and making change. And it's really refreshing for me as a board member to read a board paper and read about a resident engagement or a resident feedback that has nothing to do with me, actually. I think that's when it's really strong that it's not me at the board table that's making a difference. It's every single resident that's participating. And a successful housing association with a good practice around resident engagement will know it's not just hearing it at the highest levels. Actually, it's hearing it on the ground. I won't say the lowest levels because I don't think that's where it is. Actually, the highest level are that front-facing person who works with a resident, that person who hands a new tenant their keys for the first time and explains to them how you turn on the boiler, how you turn on the gas, that person who receives that complaint and understands what's gone wrong in the organisation. When you're hearing things at that level and then acting on it, then I think resident engagement's really successful. And then if at a strategic level, we can feed into the long-term goals and aims and visions and values of an organisation, then again, I think that's really successful. But it has to be a really holistic approach and a joined-up approach that every layer of the business hears resident voice and does something with it.
Yeah. That's really, really interesting, Peter, because you've touched on some really key aspects of resident engagement and housing associations and residents working together. You touched on lived experience. And also another thing that you've mentioned as well is the importance of all the different touch points. So all the touch points, all the interactions that residents have with their landlord and the importance of all of them and how they contribute into the whole, aspect of resident engagement. So it's not just having somebody on the board, but it's just having those different areas that residents can basically interact with their landlords. So it's really important. There's something else I wanted to touch on, which would mean that we're going to digress slightly. So I hope you don't mind. Yeah. And it just to take your mind back to where we were during COVID. I know, society has evolved since then and things are slowly, going back to, everyone's going back to the office and everything. But when we think about our frontline housing officers, the ones you just mentioned, when you were talking about someone getting their new flat and everything, the role of frontline housing staff has really expanded since COVID. They've had to deal with a lot more. And I'd really like to understand what your views are in terms of how housing associations or housing providers can support those staff so that they can continue to deliver under those pressures.
Yeah, thank you. I've got so many thoughts on this. I think it's such a complex question, to be honest. There's obviously issues around training and support that if housing officers are being asked and frontline staff are being asked to do so much more, they need to be trained and supported to be able to deliver that. we also need to make sure. So when I've met with staff at Peabody, for example, I always ask the question, why do you do this? Why are you working in this sector? Because actually it's a difficult sector to work in, but it's such an important one. Housing and people's homes and their well-being is the foundation for everything else. It's the platform from which people build their lives. And I think all of the people who answer that question are in it for the right reasons. Almost essentially, I want to help people. I want to help people. And so we need to make sure as organisations, we can enable our staff to do their first calling, which is to help people. So if someone's got a repair that needs to be done, the frontline person might need extra training on knowing how to use the system, understanding some, nuance on the repairs. But ultimately, once all that training is done and they've got all that knowledge, when they feed that back into the system needs to work for them so that enables them to do their job, which is helping them. So I think training and the way organisations are set up are really important. But I do think it's a wider piece of work because it's not just in housing where people are asking to do more. I'm also a school governor where school teachers are on the phone to local authorities to talk about people's housing situations, where they're caring for children in a more holistic way. We've got community nurses who are doing more than just their nursing. So we've got lots of frontline people who are doing more than perhaps their job description says, because when you're working with people, you're working with a whole person. You're not just working with them as a housing professional. You're not just working with them as their house. So you actually could be working with them as a mother of 3 children or a couple who have other issues. You don't leave a part of yourself when you're a person. So I think we need to acknowledge that we don't work in a silo, and we need to equip people to be able to transcend some of those silos that we create as society. So, if our house isn't good, for example, and our child doesn't have a space to do their homework, that impacts on their school, which may impact on something else. Or if our house isn't in good condition, that will impact on people's health and well-being and their performance at work and all those sort of things. So I think it's really important that we understand the job has expanded, but people have always been complex. And perhaps the support systems in other spaces aren't there in the way they were anymore. So we're all being asked to do more. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that fact and therefore equip our staff teams and our frontline staff to be able to address some of those issues. And that's through good communication as well, good links with sectors outside of ours. So, the housing office has got really good relationships with the local police service when it comes to antisocial behaviour, that they have some relationships with, school community outreach worker if necessary, so that where your skill set stops, you can at least pass it on to someone where their skill set starts. So I think that's really important to think about for the future.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really like how you talked about this question, or would I say answered this question, because you've acknowledged that yes, they are pressures. You've acknowledged that there is a point, there's only a certain point that we can get to as housing providers, and we need to be able to work together, which kind of links into that aspect of working with other members of the community, because it's not something that we can achieve on our own. And you touched on training, which is quite important. Earlier, when I mentioned the Better Social Housing Review, one of the recommendations of the Better Social Housing Review is about training and ensuring that the role of a housing officer becomes, a role of choice, so that when people come out of, education or whatever level, they will think about the sector as a place where they want to have a long-term career, and it's a great sector to work in. That's why, you have people like yourself and myself and other wonderful colleagues that work, in the sector and continue giving. And that question that you said you ask people, that why are you in the sector, is such a valid question, because is a sector where you're part of changing people's lives. So to want to work in the sector, you have to want to be there to want to do it.
And I think as well with that, I think that's probably why this conference is so popular with staff teams as well, because actually the customer is the reason why they're here. And so a conference that's focused on customer and resident engagement will draw people with that mindset, will draw members of staff who, want to get closer, want to understand the frustrations, but also want to improve on their service and their practice and what they deliver. Because I believe most people, I won't say everyone, but I believe everyone comes to work wanting to do a good job. wanting to give their best. And I think a conference like this, which is made up of residents and professionals and hopefully senior leaders, maybe board members, will attract people who want to improve outcomes for residents, for customers in every tenure and makeup that is a social housing, shared ownership, leaseholders, whatever housing associations are doing. This is a good space to understand how that needs to be delivered.
Thanks, Peter. So, Peter, you are, apart from being the chair, you're also part of the advisory board. So it means that you've been really instrumental in helping us plan the conference. What topics are you personally looking forward to learning more about at the conference in February?
I think, because I run a small charity in Birmingham that does community development. So one of the things I'm really interested in is looking at how the role of housing associations for social cohesion. And I think now with the temperature and climate of the country, that this is more important than ever. Actually, we can look at the world that we're living in at the moment, the country that we're living in, and we can see a lot of divisiveness, a lot of things that separate us when there are so many things that we have in common. And one of, I think, the real lessons of housing is that you can help to form communities and spaces that break down barriers, that break down misconceptions, that bring people together. And so I think looking at the sessions on the role of housing associations in social cohesion are really, really interesting to me, because I think we've got a really big part to play. I think if people feel safe, well, and happy in their lives, in their homes, then that extends to their neighbours and their communities and the greater space around us. And it might sound idealistic and utopian, but that was my experience of growing up in social housing. Actually, I had neighbours from different walks of life and different backgrounds on either side of me on our road. And that helped us to form a close community that was invested in the common good. So our community wasn't where we were from, it's where we were at. And I think we are building homes, we are looking after communities that are diverse. And so we can play a big role in challenging some of the more divisive voices that exist. The other thing I'm also looking forward to at the conference is the balancing the customer needs with service realities. I think it's really important that everyone understands what the pressures are in the sector, but also what the pressures are for residents and the customer. And I think being open and honest about these challenges from both sides will help people to move forward collectively, as opposed to being at odds, at war with each other almost, where residents have lost trust with their housing association. We need to rebuild that trust, rebuild that respect, and I think those will provide better outcomes for us all.
Thank you very much, Peter. I completely agree with you. Trust is something that's, it's a journey, and we continue to build that trust and build stronger relationships between landlords and residents. This was the whole purpose of the initiative, together with tenants, which the National Housing Federation put together after the tragic event at Grenfell, to strengthen relationships between landlord and residents and to build that trust as well. Peter, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having this chat with you. Thank you for anyone that's listening. We would really like it if you can join us on the 24th of February 2026 at Senate House in London. Hope to see you there. Take care.
Thank you, Evelyn.